There we go. All right, well, welcome. So we are starting Genesis, and I sent you all a little bit of background information. I don't want to discuss it in depth just because I don't. So Sue, I will send you, I created a little bit of a primer to show some of the background information of like how Genesis came to be in the form that it is. Just before we jump into Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, the very beginning, did you all have any questions or clarifications from that primer that came up when you were reading that may have raised any questions just right off the bat? Yeah.
I don't remember getting a primer.
Oh,
It was on email.
it was, okay. It
What was the gist of it? What was were we talking about the different writers or?
Right. So Mary Ellen, in the same email that I sent the book recommendation, there should also have been a document attached.
Okay.
However, the introduction to this book is basically a more in-depth discussion of the thing that I put together. The long and the short of it is, Genesis is kind of a composite book. For the first 5 books of the Bible, they can kind of trace out 5 different authors, or 4. It depends how you cut the cake. There's 4, and then one of the authors, they kind of split. You can split hairs and divide it into 2 or 3. So the main views. So Genesis was a long oral tradition for a while, and at a later date got written down on paper. But they think that it got written down after the kingdom of Israel had already split into 2 different distinct nations, which created 2 oral traditions that are similar, but not the same. In addition, you have the priestly writers that had concerns about their kind of everything that is in their world. So a lot of focus on cosmology, a lot of focus on like actually priestly things in their lineage. So that tradition gets added in. And then you have the Deuteronomistic historian, who is kind of seen as like the editor of all of the different traditions. The thing to know is, while these stories are very ancient, and we can tell just by how, or their comparison to other Near Eastern stories, the stories themselves go back very far, but they think Genesis, in the form that we find it today, only dates back to the exile. That in the exile, they were trying to put their tradition together. And so they seamed together many different versions of the same story to create basically this composite narrative that is Genesis. So the book recommendation of James Kugel will go into that in the first chapter of like exactly those traditions, which is why this is a really cool book to have alongside it. I created a 2-page document to quickly hit some of the high points of like when it was written, when they think certain things were combined. But just know that there's many different points of view in Genesis. Even in Exodus and Leviticus, you can kind of see where these traditions are coming together. And there's, so one of the cool things about this is the editor of these books, the one who put together all the different traditions, it's very clear that they didn't prioritize one tradition over another, but instead included both or all. So we have many different points of view, and one isn't really given supremacy over the other, but it also creates an interesting work for historians that we can tell that there's multiple narratives and people try to pick it apart in different ways. And so a lot of this is guesses at who wrote what. So we don't actually know who wrote what. Just know that there's many different traditions combined into this one book. So is that a good introduction?
Yay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any questions about that? Okay. The other thing I will say is that the person who numbered the Bible, we talked about this a little bit when we were doing Matthew, the person who put the chapters and verse numbers in, that came in around the European Renaissance. And we don't always agree with the numbering that happened. And Genesis 1 is actually a prime example of this, because the first creation story goes through the first chapter and the first 4 verses of chapter 2. So forgive the original person who numbered this story. They did not actually pay attention to certain details, which is why we're not just covering all of 1, but all of Genesis 1 through Genesis 2, verse 4. All right. So with all of that as our groundwork, let's jump in. So I know this story is familiar. I mean, this is one of our Hallmark stories. Most of you can probably tell me the gist from memory. I'm curious, in your read through for today, was there anything in particular that jumped out at you at this read through of what's going on in the text? Any details you hadn't realized? Any texture that you were like, huh, this is interesting?
I think the part about saying evening first and then morning. And my Bible gives a notation that would be the Jewish day begins at sundown. So it's evening and then morning, whereas we would normally think morning and then evening.
Yeah.
Right.
Interesting. I thought the style of writing was a little archaic compared to some parts of the Bible. It just seemed like it was, a little stilted in a way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, Joanne.
Hi, Joanne.
Hey,
Hello,
Joe,
good morning, everyone.
we're
So
recording.
Mhm.
Gotcha.
So we're just right now jumping in with Genesis, and just with the kind of the first creation story, thinking about any observations we made with the first read through before we jump in and kind of discuss the details of what's going on. So any other initial observations about this story?
Nope.
It was fun to read it again.
Right.
Familiar.
All right, so let's go ahead and jump in to these 6/7 days. Addressing what Helen you brought up about there's like an archaic stiltedness to how the narrative happens. This is seen as to be part of the priestly tradition, which is very ritualized. So that's a little bit of an explanation of why it has this very kind of formulaic tone. Is it's seen, or one of the things that we definitely see prioritized in this creation is order. But there's also a bit of like stylized poetry going on here, that in the Hebrew language, it's well documented that like one of the highest forms of poetry is witty repetition. I think of when I was learning about the book of Jonah, there was one point where Jonah's about to be thrown overboard, but they don't want to yet. And they pray the prayers, they sacrifice the sacrifices, and they vow the vows. And that's like prime Hebrew poetry. You repeat the same word as much as possible. When you're doing something poetically, you're going to repeat the same phrase over and over and over again. So this is like the highest form of Hebrew poetry in a way, because there's so much that's repeated. And that's purely style and what they enjoyed. So there's this one part where they think that this comes from the priestly tradition, where they're talking about cosmology and the world and all of creation, but there's also this like repetitiousness that they just, it's kind of like how we prize sonnets. Sonnets are like the highest form of English poetry and all the rules. They're like, forget the sonnets. We want repetition. Repeat as much as possible. So that's a little bit about the style.
It's very visual. I mean, I can
Yeah.
picture, you know, God just kind of doing it, you know, it's
Mhm.
just not in a nice way. I mean, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very visual. I was just reading, and I noticed I didn't know it was repetition. I guess I didn't pay attention to that, but it seemed poetic to me.
Yeah.
I
Mhm.
noticed the phrase, "and it was so," is repeated
Yeah.
several.
Mhm.
And the sentences are short compared to, say, Paul's writing later on. It's kind of easy to read compared to that. And it's kind of, well, as I say, short sentences.
Yeah. Yeah, there's an accessibleness. I mean, either between the image or the sentence structure,
Yeah.
I feel like there's a reason why we go to this one so often. It's digestible
Yes, it
and
is.
in the visualness. So pausing here though, what are some other creation stories you know from any point in time, any other creation story that you've heard that's not biblical? Because this isn't the only creation story of the ancient world. What are some of the other stories?
I know the Native Americans have one, but I can't quite
Mhm.
in my memory bank, but I know they have one.
The Potawatomi from Michigan have a story of Turtle Island is the one I know.
Mm.
So there's the Gilgamesh, but I haven't read that for about 50 years, or
Okay,
60.
do you remember just overall what happens in the Epic of Gilgamesh?
I remember reading it, and that they're pointing out similarities to
Mhm.
the Jewish tradition. So I think the context, and of course, this was a long time ago, my freshman year in college. It seemed to be really saying this isn't unique, you know, that was the point. But I don't remember. No, I
Okay.
don't.
The Greek and Roman mythology, of course, must have had one, but I don't remember the stories. But
Yeah.
Romulus and Remus found
that's
in
right.
Rome.
Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
So with the Greek and Roman creation story, if you remember or if you know the goddess Gaia, which is considered like Earth is Gaia, the creation story is about her kind of being killed and part of her being kind of dismembered to create the different parts of the world. And so you have and then you have the gods battling where I forgot the name of the giants. Oh goodness, why is my brain pooping out on me here? Anyways, but you have like Zeus conquering his father. So you have like the primordial goddess who is kind of killed and subdued, and then you have these successive kings that are like killing each other, whether it's like eating your children and then them being saved, and kind of this very violent kind of creation where all these things kind of come out because these different personalities are clashing. Even if you think about like how humans got fire, it's kind of this war in the gods where one god thinks that the humans need fire and he's punished. The Epic of Gilgamesh is similar. It's that one I think it is brought up in contrast to Genesis. It also comes up in the story of Noah because there's a flood story in it. But there too, you have this goddess figure that Gilgamesh kills, and that becomes the earth. And so now this is not the same. I don't know as many like East Asian myths that are like more like Chinese and Japanese, though that I'm not familiar with their mythological tradition as much. The like US native traditions, there's some really cool ones that I've read, but they come from a very different mythological tradition. But a lot of the ones that are in and around like the Mediterranean and into like what we would now consider the Middle East or the Levant, there's a lot of stories of goddesses being killed and that creating the earth. So there is a theory behind this that says that because women's reproductive systems may have earlier been worshipped, that the coming of gods killing these goddesses was actually kind of the subjugation of women that was kind of ritualized. And so when men started being the domination, the like power, like having the social power, you kind of mythologize that and you explain it. And it's like, oh, well, yes, we had this goddess, but then look, Zeus conquered it or Gilgamesh conquered it. And it kind of explains your current social order. So thinking about that, where a lot of creation stories are violent, involve conquering and killing and creating and using divine goddesses as like the fundamental creation of matter, what is different about this story?
There's no destruction, it's all creation.
Right.
Totally different. And it does make, is it in this one that Eve is taken from the rib, or is that the other one?
That's the other one.
Oh,
We'll
okay.
get to that one next week.
But it doesn't, okay, it's more than, Eve is more of a co-creator, I mean, a partner.
Yeah, in this story, it's let's create humankind in our image, and God created them male and female, and they're just, they appear together here. And so how is God creating in this?
It's from the, he says it,
Yeah.
and God, it's a word, his words. Is that right? I'm not.
Yeah.
Yeah. And God said it was good. Yeah, God is talking.
I often wonder, I wonder whom he's talking to.
That's a good point.
That is, yeah.
Who's listening?
Is God talking to God's self? I mean, because we do have the divine plural later on in the story. So, so we have this divine God. I mean, that's redundant. We have a divine figure speaking the world into being, who is not at all destructive, but 100% creative. And this is where it's one of those that I don't like tying some of these stories purely to like historical fact. I feel like these are the kind of things that we miss of what this text is saying about God. Because what does it say about God in the context that this story was being told in cultures that had violent creation stories for their other god, for the other gods in the area? What is being said about God in the context of contrast between this story and other stories?
Well, he's creating, not destroying, that, and this sounds like a very beneficent type of individual. He's not trying to control or punish or do anything. He's just trying to make something good, I guess, out of nothing, other than his word.
Well, everything's positive. Everything is giving, providing. I don't know where the initial ideas came from, but when Larry, you mentioned that he's saying and everything is good, that it could well be saying it to himself. that, you know, how many times have you done something and you look at it and you say, that's really good.
Mhm.
I think the contrast to the other creation stories is the lack of violence and destruction. That everything here is creating and building and providing. And it must have been a serious conflict as people are hearing this for the first time. You know, when they're used to a God they're afraid of, or that's full of vengeance, or whatever. This must have been, you know, a real eye opener for them.
Would a proper word be selflessness?
Mhm.
Yeah. I like that. Say more.
Yeah.
He's not, well, again, it's back to not destroying. He's not taking of something to make something of it. Destroying, something's not being destroyed to make a piece of it. It just comes from him giving to us.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound as if he's trying to create something that he can control. I mean, behind it, it seems, you know, he's doing it for something else, for something good, for the people he's going to create, I gather, you know. So it's again a positive, selfless sort of thing that he's doing for others.
And building on that, Larry, it's obvious he had a plan.
Mhm.
There's a sequence. There's a logical sequence as you build and add to the original night and day creation. And so, you know, you can read all sorts of things into that, but he had a plan and it was good.
So that's
Well,
actually, oh, go for it.
I was just wondering if this was the other one written first? If it was, if it, do you have any idea? Because this one seems advanced in the way it views God as kind and creative, as opposed to, you know, I keep thinking about making man out of mud. Is that in this? Is there one about that, or is that a different creation story? But it's just different. There's no story about the garden is in the second story where Eve goes and screws up. Yeah.
So one of the things that Sue keeps hinting at, just to like put it in context, is scholars very much think that there's two different creation stories.
Okay.
Which goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, that Genesis is a composite of many traditions. And so this, like I said, is kind of considered the priestly creation story. And the second one is so that one, like I said, we're going to discuss it next week because I want to show the contrast between these two stories. But you will see that the timelines aren't the same, and they kind of like it kind of like rewinds time and like starts at the begin, like near the beginning of creation again, which is why we kind of separate these stories out of saying these probably come from like two different traditions. And this one is very much more like almost galactic point of view, because we're talking like big scale. We're talking about the creation of the sun and the moon. What we're going to talk about next week is very nitty gritty. It's very human. It's very like, I mean, and that's the one that has us come from the mud. But that very much is a second tradition. So like even my Bible here says another account of creation, because we kind of separate these two out. So that's just a context of like, yes, we actually kind of have two creation stories, and if you're technical, the Bible actually has like 3 or 4 that are littered in other parts of the Bible of creation, which is there's another one in Proverbs which is fun.
I was really asking, I know they're two different ones. I just wondered, that feels to me like the priestly one, even though it comes first in the Bible, might have been written later. And that was my question. Do we know?
We don't know, only because we don't have a version of Genesis where like the different traditions are broken apart.
Okay, okay.
And so that sounds like a fair guess, but there's really not a good way to prove it per
Okay.
se.
Nothing to compare it to. All right.
Yeah.
Just curious.
Yeah. So, but let's jump over to kind of what Mary Ellen was talking about of like, there is an order, because that's one of the really cool things that is going on is like, what is actually happening day by day? So let's actually walk through and see what's happening. So one of the initial details, and there are so many years, I skipped over one of the weird details that happens at the very beginning. So in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while the wind of God swept over the face of the waters.
Mm.
Yeah,
The
Mary
water
Ellen.
existed. The waters already existed.
Right. So this actually gets to, there is a discrepancy in translation, whether you are dealing with some original Hebrew interpretation versus like later Christian interpretations. Because the discrepancy is whether the initial words is in the beginning when God created versus when God began to create. There are different interpretations of the grammar. And one implies that God created everything out of nothing, and the other one kind of implies that there was stuff already there.
Yeah.
Can you go into verse 2?
Mhm.
I don't have a problem with the earth was a formless void.
Yes.
Darkness covered the face of the deep. Is there any interpretation of what the deep is all about?
Yeah. So in the ancient world, the scariest place in your life is water, specifically the ocean. The ocean is terrifying. The ocean is uncontrollable. The ocean is just chaos incarnate. And so it's very common in a lot of ancient worldviews is that water is the representation is of chaos and chaos incarnate. And the Jewish worldview sees that in the beginning, there is this watery chaos that is everything. So the earth being the void and darkness covered, it's basically just this watery, chaotic mess. And so this is also the time where they didn't know if the ocean had an end. They didn't know if the ocean had a bottom. They got like the ocean still today. I mean, scientists say that we know more about the surface of the moon than what's happening in the depths of the ocean. And the ocean kind of has a mind of its own that we still can't control. And in their worldview, the ocean is chaos. And so what they think is that the beginning is just this oceanic watery chaos. And that's where everything starts, is the deep, which is the unknowable. It's the unknowable, the unseen, where everything is chaos and nothing's predictable.
I had always, before God created anything, I had always pictured existence to be like when you turn out all the lights and there's no spot of light anywhere. It's just this empty darkness. And so, this puts a whole new image for me going on.
So where this gets to have some really cool symbolism is actually is taking this idea of watery chaos and bringing it back to our tradition. Because when we talk about baptism, we talk about it being a recreation or a rebirth. And I know this is not the same. A lot of Presbyterian traditions do more like a sprinkle, or like just because we do a lot of infant baptisms, and it's generally not looked upon well to dunk an infant in a tub. So we tend to drip the water on people's heads. I came from the Disciples of Christ tradition, and I was fully dunked, which seems to be what John the Baptist was also doing, was doing a dunk. And there's a lot of writing in some of the ancient world of it being a return to that watery chaos. And that's where the recreation happens, is the return to the chaos, and God is pulling you out from that chaotic thing as a new person. Kind of like in these days of creation, God is pulling the world out of the watery chaos. God can pull us out of our own watery chaos.
Wow. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so we have the void and the deep, this watery, chaotic place. But the second detail is the wind of God swept over the face of the waters. So the Hebrew word for the wind, it's ruach, which is nice because it has this nice H that forces you to breathe and literally create wind. But the term for wind and spirit are interchangeable. So it could also be translated just as easily to say, and the Spirit of God swept over the face of the water.
Okay.
So
I think it sometimes translated that way, so that that seems more familiar.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that in the King James Bible, or?
It really depends translation to translation which one it chooses, because like I said, the words are identical. It's context that,
yeah.
And so it's one of those things where it's kind of talking about both, because there is this wind movement. So it's like the wind of God is appropriate, but it's also talking about the Spirit of God being kind of wind-like. So it's not really an either or, it's a both and.
Okay.
So it makes sense then that God is speaking, because speaking is kind of this kind of wind-like thing.
Mm-hmm.
So God is speaking things as the wind is blowing.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first thing God creates or says is, let there be light, and there was light, and God separated the light and said that God said that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. So this is a movement that we will see. Like there's this moment of creation. There is light, and then there is light, but then God separates. So it's a moment of creation and separation.
Mm-hmm.
So day one, we're just dealing with light and dark. Literally, is there light? Is there, and separating it from the dark spaces. What's not created here is a source of light.
Mm-hmm.
So keep that in mind.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
So on the second day, and like Clay said, there is evening and then there is morning, which is the Jewish conception. So this is just a fun tidbit. When measuring Shabbat, like when does their day of rest start? There is a lot of rabbis that needed to like figure out exactly when does one day start and the next begin. So this is one of the things that they're, because they want to follow the rules, well, they want to know exactly when the transition from days happens. And the official ruling is the day begins when there's 3 stars visible in the sky. because you can't always see the horizon line, especially when you're in the mountainous region. But it actually brings up this interesting point that there's a lot of bifurcation that's going to happen. Like God creates and then separates, God creates and then separates. And the first thing God creates is day and night. But we still have an intermediate space of like twilight or dawn or dusk, of an intermingled space where these are separated, but not quite.
Hmm.
The transition space.
Right. And so we'll hold on to that. And if we have time at the end, we can discuss more of that. But there still is gray area, even though these two categories are being created. So the second one is said, God's let there be a dome in the midst of the waters and let it separate the waters from the other waters. What do you all think about this, about there being a dome in the sky? What comes to mind of what's happening here?
Well, I thought the dome was the sky.
Oh, okay.
What'd
Any
you
other
say?
thoughts?
Hmm?
Say,
My Bible says firmament.
Mhm.
Mine does too.
And so firmament to me means earth.
Mhm.
Dome, I wouldn't have had a clue. But firmament is much clearer. Yeah. Yeah, I have a revised standard
Mhm.
version.
All right. Well, can I share a picture with you all of what some artist renditions of this cosmology looks like?
Sure.
Because this is not what I personally expected. So some of what's fascinating is some of these things actually explain some of our language. And so in the Jewish world or worldview, in the ancient Jewish worldview, it's not that they're like God created an air bubble and like pushed the water aside. There's literally waters over top of the sky, which is why it's blue. And then the sun and moon and stars in there, they are below this kind of like wall holding the sky up. And this is where we get the term floodgates. For when it rains, it's there's holes in the firmament of the sky and the waters from the dome above come back down.
Oh,
And so like the story of Noah, there's a talk about the waters from above being let down. They're talking about the bubble up here.
wow.
Okay.
So, and then talking about the depths of Sheol is kind of this kind of pit in the columns of the earth, in kind of the depths of the roots of the earth. But they kind of see it as this kind of watery globe, and there's kind of this air pocket in the middle of it, which is where everything happens.
That's cool.
Mhm. So there's a few other renditions. The vault, some sources talk more about, instead of dome or firmament, it's the vault. And so it's seen as this is the vault of heaven, which is kind of the top of the dome. The water above the vault, which is that kind of, or what we saw of like the floodgates. And then heaven as the dwelling place of God is kind of outside the watery dome that kind of encases us. So this is another representation. This is there's conversation of like the pillars of heaven, and kind of outside it all is this like primeval ocean, the watery. So in their world, the watery chaos that God's creating still kind of exists. It's just like outside the boundaries of our world.
So God created the boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah. So all the rest of creation is going to take place inside that kind of dome area.
Inside the dome.
And so God separates the waters that were under the dome from those that were above the dome, or at least that's what my translation says.
That
And so the
explains
dome was
verse
called the
7,
sky.
yeah.
What was up?
Okay. I said that explains verse 7 then, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
Never
then
thought about it.
we get some more separation going on. Let the waters under the sky be gathered into one place. And so dry land appears. And so we see this kind of the separation of the waters, and then kind of like, okay, we're going to like push the waters aside and we're going to see some land. So another separation going on. But remember, we still have like marshlands and tidal pools and all these things. So even though there's separation, there's still kind of this gray area that we know to exist. And so it was good, and it continues, and God creates the vegetation. So separating the water out and then pulling forth this vegetation. And we see fruit and trees and seeds, everything kind of just make like terraforming the earth. So by the end of, what day is this? The third day, we have so day 1 is kind of creation of light and day. So day 2 is separation for the domes, and then we have this terraforming happening. So keep this in mind. We have light source, we have sky and sea, and then we have land. So those are, we kind of have created our 3 habitation points. And so the next 3 days are kind of revisions of these first 3 days of creation. Because the 4th day, we're going back to the light sources, and God kind of congeals it and was like, okay, we can't just have like general light. We're going to have a sun. We're going to create the like solidify it into one sun for the day, and we're going to create a moon for the night and the stars as guides. And so God kind of refines day 1 and says, okay, we're gonna refine this, make it a little bit of like one light source. And so that's day 4. Day 5, God talks about the waters again. Let the waters bring forth swarms of creatures, and let birds in the air fly above. So God has created the dome, like separated the domes of the water, created airspace and oceans. And now on day 5, God's like, okay, we're going to populate this area. We can fill this with other things. And so life gets introduced into the oceans and the air, and we see the creation of fish and birds of every kind, and call it good, says, be fruitful and multiply. And day 6, so day 3 was about land. And so day 6 is populating the land. We have this refinement again, where God fills the land with every kind of creature, creeping things and wild animals and every kind. And so we see kind of, there's this, it's interesting how they distinguish like the wild animals, and God evidently creates already tamed animals. And but out of that, and saw all the creation of animals, and it was all good. And then in their worldview, they take a second step and said, and then God said, and now this is interesting. There's a lot of talk about what's going on in this next verse, but verse 26 says, God said, let us, plural, make humans in our, plural, image, and according to our likeness. So animals are created and humans are kind of set aside. And we have this interesting verse about like, what does it mean to be created in the image of God? Like, what is it that God is distinguishing? And who is God talking to in the plural? So
I could put, I guess, Christian spin on this. And God said, let us make humankind in our image. My mind wants to connect this as God speaking to himself, but speaking to himself as the Trinity, that, you know, he already has, he's not seeing himself as a single entity when he refers to us. So I don't know if that's an appropriate interpretation, but that's what my brain wants to do.
It sounds, it gives the implication that he's saying, I think this would be a good idea, and so now we're going to do it, rather than decreeing, I am now going to create man, So it's sort of a nice collaborative sort of effort. He's
That's
speaking
nice.
to his conscience.
It's unlikely to be the Trinity,
Mhm. Yes.
but I feel like it's likely to be the Trinity in about 2,000 years before.
But if there is God, could there be other heavenly beings with him
Angel.
there?
Mhm. Yeah. So pulling out some of the threads being talked about here, which is interesting. So when this story was originally told, there was not a conception of the Trinity. That
Right.
doesn't mean we can't see it there. And it
Oh.
kind of makes sense with the beginning of John. The beginning of John is one of our other creation stories. And it's like, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and he was in the beginning with God, and all things came into being through him, and without him, nothing came into being. Like, that's part of the Christian belief system. So yeah, we look back and say, okay, like Jesus was there in the beginning, the Spirit of God was there in the beginning. We've already seen the appearance of the Spirit. Maybe this was introduced in the language and they just didn't see it. Or maybe we just have meaning, and just because it wasn't meaningful in that way to them doesn't mean it can't be meaningful to us today. So that's round one, or like logic one. That is completely fair. That we can take our own meaning from it. Logic two is kind of more Larry's line of logic of like, this is a collaborative thing of like God kind of consulting with God's self still in the singular, which is what's talked about as the royal we, because we have a long,
Yeah.
we see this in documents that like kings will talk in the plural, because it's not just like the king talking, but it's like the king talking on behalf of the nation, which is plural. So we have this royal we. And so a lot of people just think it's the royal we entering in here. But
Well, the
Sue,
earth has been-
Sue and Clay, your comments kind of bring up this other interesting thing, is that later in scripture, we have the existence of heavenly beings, but we don't know when they were created. We have angels, and people look at the text and we're like, where are they? They're not here, but they exist later on, and we don't know. It's not there. So could possibly God be talking to the heavenly host? Yeah. I mean, our traditions of like the angels and like the fall of Lucifer, the morning star, is technically before the creation of humankind. So people kind of go like, like what's going on here? And so we don't talk about angels and demons in the same way, but still in the ancient mind, it's like, where do we put them in this order? Because we don't know. So, but going to the second question, what does it actually mean to be created in the image of God? What is being transferred here? Because it doesn't explain. So what does it?
As we talked about before in the comment I made before, that everything he created was positive, was intended to be good. And so I'm going to take the leap that if I'm created in his image, then I'm also created to be positive, to be constructive rather than destructive.
Yeah.
If it says God created all living things, giraffes, elephants, hippopotami. He's also now going to create man. And and he says, we are going to create man in my image. Maybe he is implying that we should look like him, act like him, be identified as something different from the cattle and the dogs and the cats. I don't know.
Mhm. Makes sense. Mhm.
Yeah, in a way, this kind of goes to the question that biologists have asked for years of like, what actually makes humans different from animals? Because there's like this gut reaction that like we're different. I mean, for heaven's sakes, we build buildings and we like make, like, is it our tool making? Is it our intellect? Like what is it actually that separates us? And so there is a few routes of traditional interpretation of what the like image of God is, and you have hit them all. I mean, some people say it's our sense of morality. Our morality is what both makes us human and is what is copied in the image of God. Because you've never really heard of an evil giraffe. Like giraffes don't like have a sense of morality. They just kind of, there's a sense that like animals just kind of are, but they're not like conscious of themselves. So is it like our self-understanding?
Yeah. They live by instinct.
Right.
Mhm.
But there's also this creative capacity, which is interesting, that like this whole story's been talking about God creating and God speaking. And so is it our ability to be creative? Because in a few verses, God hands over some of this ability of you have domain over it, which is less of the like being dominant and domineering, but more of like you're the caretaker. But it kind of hands over this like ability for creation. Like this is your responsibility now. Like I've set the whole system up, but like you are in my image, so you take care of it.
Mhm.
You're
But
good
a very
steward. Mhm.
Hmm?
Stewards.
Oh, stewards, yeah.
Stewards.
But then there's also the line of logic that people are for sometimes good and sometimes ill effect said that there's something of our physicalness that is in the image of God, because we see God incarnate in Jesus. Where that gets dangerous is because there is this was put into bad hands and went down the route of eugenics, saying some people are more in the image of God than others. Specifically, when they discovered the Americas, a lot of missionaries were like, white people are in the image of God and the natives are not, which gave the right for their removal from the land, was this idea that some people don't have the image of God. So that's where it gets misused.
Mhm.
But I do think it's actually powerful to talk about, like, there's something in us that is the image of God and there's no human lacking it. Like that to me is beautiful when you think of what it means for how we interact with people.
Mhm. Mhm. I guess in a way too, you could say that when God turned over the management of the universe to man, he also gave up control of the way they did it. And, not everybody did it in the right way.
The free will. Huh?
Yeah. So he did away with all of us once, but he promised he wasn't going to do it again.
Mhm.
So at the end of Genesis 1, we see God lists all the things that God's handing over, the dominion or the stewardship of, and plants and animals and all of the things. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. And this is when we jump into chapter 2, which is where, it is universally agreed the story was cut in the wrong spot. And it continues, thus the heavens were finished and all their multitudes. And on the seventh day, God finished the work that he had done and rested from all the work. And so God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it. And on it, God rested from all the work that has been done in creation. And these generations of the heaven and earth when they were created. So that's kind of the end cap. And so all of this creation happens, and then our divine source rests on the seventh. So with a minute to go before it's 11 o'clock, what do you all think of this story? Is it what kind of pops out at you? And is there anything that's strikingly missing from this story?
I'm just pulling out of it that there's so much more than just the actual words.
Hmm.
You know, the images you showed us of the dome or whatever, it's a whole new concept for me.
Not me. Yeah, same for me. I never heard of that dome. I didn't realize God created the
Right.
Superdome, you know.
Well, he's really working hard right now. It doesn't deal at all with evil.
No,
That's true. Yeah.
it doesn't touch in human flaws. At the end of the seventh day, everything is good.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Everything's been declared good.
Mhm. But man hasn't done anything yet.
Mm-mm.
Right.
Hmm.
Right. So this is one of the reasons I love Genesis is like, I feel like if you read it, there is like, you'll get a really cool story. But this is like I love unpacking some of the images and like, because there's a lot of details that kind of can like zoom by you if you don't know to focus in on them, whether it's the dome or God hovering over the deep. I love this section of the Bible for those details going, wait, what is going on here? So we are going to pick up next week with the second creation story. My question to you is, do we want to read just the creation of man and woman, or do we want to cover the Garden of Eden story as well with the serpent?
We ought to, I don't you think we can do both of those? Huh?
Are you talking about 2 and 3 then?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Do we want to do just chapter 2 or 2 and 3?
Are you talking about doing it in one session, or are you talking about doing it at all?
Oh, doing it in one session.
Why don't we, it's not much reading. Why don't we read both
Mhm.
and then just see how we do next time?
Right.
Okay.
We'll either get through it or we won't.
It's one of those, I don't know how much time the chapter 2 will take, but I also feel like it'll be hard to discuss 2 without us just instinctively wanting to jump and talk about some of the things in chapter 3, because they are like one story.
Yeah, yeah.
I like
Okay.
Larry's idea.
Yeah.
Can I go back just a minute? There's something here that maybe my Bible says it a little differently. Going back to chapter 1 here, the earth was at first a shapeless, chaotic mass.
Mm-hmm.
So he divided the light from the darkness. And then in 6, he said, wait a minute here, together. They talked about it just being vapors. And then in 6, he let those vapors be separated to form the sky above and the ocean above, below, whereas you're saying the oceans or the water was already here. This one sounds like it's not here.
Interesting. That probably is what I would say is a massaging of the original Hebrew.
Yeah. definitely. I think, yes.
So there,
I was curious after we were speaking about it and moved on, I'm kind of like, wait a minute.
oh, sorry.
Yeah. I
No,
thought,
I wasn't, we were already into 2 when I realized
yeah.
Gotcha.
Well, the word vapor is a lot different from water.
Yeah.
That's,
well, but he said there was vapor there and let the vapors separate.
see, that's
form
not
the
in my
cloud.
Bible at all. The word vapor is nowhere in mine.
Yeah.
Vapor
I
is
don't know. It's
definitely
just
different
another
from
thought,
water.
but thank you, Chris.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, so that's one where sometimes with the more like modernized translations that are trying to make it like I think of like the Common English Bible or the Message. I don't know what version. I remember you telling me and I forgot what version that one is. Some of those translations, to make it understandable, sometimes they will kind of mesh it more with our modern understanding, which we today know that there is not a big like covering of the ocean over our skies. We know that it's blue because of light refraction and things like that. And so that one, I think it's just like, if you want to read something that's closer to the Hebrew, look up like an NIV version. NIV or
Right.
NRSV tend to be very close to the Hebrew. And I don't think it's bad when they kind of do this massaging and kind of make it more understandable. Because as you can see, there is a lot of like Hebrew understanding of the world that we just know is not correct. But it says something in a literary sense, even if we don't think it is literally true. And so some kind of try to make it closer to our reality. And that's not bad. It serves a different purpose.
Right, that's exactly, yes.
Yeah.
I just wondered what all that water was doing up there. You know?
Right.
It's raining.
Yeah, raining. I
Right.
guess.
Well, that's, I mean, kind of the explanation of where rain comes from is there's a dome of rain over top of
Right,
us.
yeah, right, yeah.
And it explains how a flood can happen. It just
Yes.
all opens up at once and.
And the Superdome leaks.
Yeah.
The last thing that I will say are
Yes,
just
please.
2 other observations, just for fun as we're wrapping up here. I know Mary Ellen had to already leave, but one observation that some people point out that's just fascinating is like, how long is one of these days? Because the
Yep,
ancient people
1,000
didn't have
years.
clocks like we did. So how long is a day? But that becomes especially interesting when you realize that the sun, the method in which we keep time, is not created until day 4. There's just light and there's just dark. And so they have no way to keep track of time theoretically. So that's
Yeah.
just like a fascinating detail, is that the sun and the moon, day 4. So there can only be a 24-hour period time checker by day 4.
And yet we have the thing about a day can be 1,000 years.
Right.
1,000 years in the passage of time.
So that's actually one of the other observations that people have gone through and looked at, is like, one of the fascinating things about Genesis, not necessarily a one-to-one, but if you look at theories of evolution, Genesis kind of follows along. Not exactly, but it's one of those that like plant matter is described as being created first, and then fish, and then birds, and then land animals. And that's not, like I said, not maybe a one-to-one, but that kind of is our progression. There was first algae, and then it like coalesced into bigger plant matters, and our first like animals that we understand were fish. And then we came out, and there's a discussion of like whether like more like bird-like things came first or land animals, but we do see some of that progression, and it's not dissimilar, which it's interesting that how these ancient people may have had an intuition of like, where is life coming from? Like where, like what's the order of creation? What's the order of our own existence? So.
Hmm.
Anyways, Any other concluding thoughts, or should I pray us out for today? All right, let us pray. Good and gracious God, Creator God, God who speaks life into this world, we just marvel at your creation, that you have created so many beautiful things, and it wasn't violent, it wasn't selfish, but Lord, you seem to have created for the beauty of it all, because you loved creation, because, I mean, at a certain point, we don't even know, but we know that it was created good, and we thank you that you created this beautiful and good world. We ask that you be with us and help us to recognize that, yes, your image dwells in us all. And may that guide us this week in how we treat one another, that we recognize that divine image in us all, and knowing that we are co-creators with you, stewards of the land and stewards of this world. So help us to live up to that commission, to be the caretakers and the stewards. We pray all this in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Thank you so much for this great discussion.
Thank you, Chris. Always appreciate
Very
it.
interesting.
Thank you. I'll be on vacation next week, so I'll look for your
I'll have to tune
recording.
in for
Another,
the last part because I missed out on some. So,
Okay.
okay.
All right. Well, let me